Chapter 3 Kraff's Breath. Nepeta hadn't been this weak, this helpless, since she had first fallen ill 2 years ago. What had started as a mild fever slowly worsened and had left her bedridden, trembling violently and unable to eat. It was not long after her father had forsaken them, not long after Garina had abandoned her, and her heavy heart had all but given up. Her mother prayed to Medra, as her condition worsened, but even she retreated from Nepeta's bedside when the seizures started. Only Tarish had been there for her, Nepeta remembered. Her younger sister had stayed by her when she was alone, when she was throwing up daily and slowly starving. The younger sister she had previously teased, called annoying and hidden from, she had been there for her. Eventually, her condition stabilized, and she was able to eat enough to survive. Tarish fed her, washed her, and helped her back onto her feet, but her body was ravaged. She could hardly walk, couldn't run, could barely speak. A whole season came and went before she was able to look after herself without Tarish's help, and she was eternally grateful to her sister because of this, not that she was ever able to return the favour. Now, as unlikely as she might have thought initially, it was Amalia who fed her, who washed her, and whispered sweet, calming words as she struggled and cried, utterly frustrated by her inability to function. Amalia, who had looked at her with suspicion, bordering on hostility, helped her to her feet once more, and half carried her out into the daylight for the first time in days. "Why are you being so nice to me?" Nepeta asked her one day, as Amalia had finished feeding her and began to brush her hair. The woman had not replied at first, as her fingers delicately unknotted her dark locks, and Nepeta was beginning to wonder if she had spoken too quietly, when Amalia's voice finally broke the silence. "I am not a cruel woman." Her words were soft, gentle. It had been so long that I had forgotten that. Perhaps her mind was still addled, but Amalia's words made no sense to Nepeta, and she cautiously asked for clarification. "What do you mean?" Amalia's fingers paused, and she felt the woman's lips briefly kiss the top of her head. "I had been here alone, for so long that I had forgotten who I was. So long that I saw you as a threat, rather than what you really are, a child of Medra." "I'm not a child," Nepeta replied, with quiet defiance. Being called child further exacerbated her sense of helplessness and angered her. "And what about Vermigold? You both live here, don't you?" "Vermigold is the Archprotector. Nothing more." Amalia's words were soft, but strained. She calmed as she continued. "And I'm aware that you're no longer a child. It is a manner of speaking. We are all children of Medra. Now hush. We shall utter no more of this today." Amalia was kind, but firm, and refused to answer any more of Nepeta's questions on the subject. Her recovery was less stilted than that of 2 years ago. It was not long before Amalia began to leave her to do things on her own, and Vermigold finally reappeared, handing her a finely polished oaken quarterstaff. She wasn't sure where he had been, or if he had just been avoiding her while she was unwell, but over the following week, as she neared full recovery, she was able to properly familiarize herself with the grandiose villa. In the mornings, she and Vermigold walked within the low-walled perimeter of the gardens, and while she protested the exertion, she did notice that the walks became gradually less exhausting. However, she knew that she would never be able to complete the circuit with any haste. The lush trees in the orchard supposedly bore fruit all year round, and gardens of herbs and brightly coloured flowers surrounded the property. During her free time, one calm day, she discovered an overgrown statuette in the shadow of a great oak. It was only a few feet off the smooth stone path that spiraled between the gardens and the main building. The statue was of a mountain, rising up to her waist out of an algae-filled basin. Among its rugged, natural contours, the mountain's structure had some characteristics that suggested femininity. Peering at it from the right angle, Nepeta could make out the rough form of a woman, kneeling in the water, with her hands over her heart. This unkempt shrine must have been dedicated to the goddess, Mother Maedra. The villa itself consisted of Vermigold's upstairs bedroom, Amalia's tiny room, a kitchen, a dining room, the magnificent library with its curved glass ceiling, and the extravagant bathroom, which she found had a lavatory that erased all refuse. Driven by curiosity and fear, she spent far too much time dropping stones, coins, and insects into it in an attempt to discover the scope of the enchantment. After extensive experimentation, she was relieved that she was not small enough to fall in, because it seemed that it was a very dangerous and indiscriminate luxury. Intricate runes, carved in an unfamiliar script, encircled the stone courtyard that was the centerpiece of the villa. From there, she could see the entirety of the township below. With simple clay roofs and plain walls, the homes in Perinch were straw huts when compared to the expertly laid stone bricks and blue-glazed tiles of Vermigold's residence. Even the mayor's house paled in comparison. When she was well enough, Vermigold brought her to his office and began to teach her once more. "It has been a little while since our last lesson, and it was your first, but shall we continue by getting an understanding of your progress regarding magical theory? Do you know the difference between a rune, a sign, and a sigil?" "Of course," Nepeta replied bluntly. "A rune is a symbol, a word of power. A sign is the conjoining of runes to make a phrase. A sigil is a complex string of runes that draws upon Kraff's breath." "Very good," Vermigold smiled, obviously more pleased with these answers than he had been by her technique. "Now, tell me about—" "If I might interrupt," she cut him off. "My memories are a little blank. What happened with the merchant, Tahar, after you turned him into an insect?" Vermigold opened his mouth, closed it again, and sighed. "I dealt with the matter. Now, Kraff's breath. You obviously know how to harness it, but do you know what it is?" "It's everything," Nepeta replied coldly, irritated that Vermigold had dismissed her question so quickly. "It's all around us. It's the exhalation of the god of magic." She wasn't entirely sure about the last part, but Vermigold nodded before replying. "It is a common misconception that Kraff's breath would be, as you say, Kraff's breath. But that is not the case. Its true nature is unknown, but we do know that it is a dormant energy that exists in all living things, in the air, and in anything that has energy of another kind, such as fire, sunlight, a great tree, and even our own bodies. The name, Kraff's breath, is but an homage to the god of magic, who was presumably worshipped by the first wizards in Maedra." "Yes." Nepeta ignored Vermigold's obvious fascination with magical theory. It wasn't that it didn't interest her, rather that she felt that she could not move on until she had a proper answer. "But how did you deal with Tahar? Is he still a bug? Did you ransom him back to the Merchants' Guild? How does this affect the peace that you have tried to maintain for so long? Does the Empire—" All right! The dwarf finally cut her off, with a high-pitched, irritated voice. Vermigold's face had gone from excited to greatly uncomfortable, and he continued, "It seems that the politics of the situation did not escape you, and you are not going to let it rest. Yes, Tahar's family and business partners were not particularly pleased about his new body, but they begrudgingly agreed that no further conflict would come of it if I returned him to them as a man. And while I heavily considered stamping him flat, the Empire's purpose in Perinch takes more importance. So that's it. Tahar even gave me the staff that you are now holding, as a meager means of restitution. Does that satisfy you?" "Perhaps. No." She changed her mind with an unsatisfied frown, but chuckled as Vermigold rolled his eyes and pulled on his short-trimmed beard with an exasperated expression. What purpose could be so important that an Imperial mage let a man go free after he had just been attacked by him, not to mention the assault on his apprentice? "He gave you a staff," Vermigold reminded her, then sighed as she raised her eyebrows, unconvinced.
I'm here as a guardian for not only Perinch, but also the cities and towns from here, all the way to the northern coast, and as far west as the boundless forest of Luria. A glorified doorman, if you like." He scowled bitterly as he paused. "You have surely noticed the circular courtyard that this villa is built around. I dare say the sigils likely interested you. Have you managed to decipher any of them?"
"No, not yet. What language are they carved in?" Nepeta replied curiously.
"Not a language," the dwarf answered haughtily. "They are a string of interconnected coordinates, more complex than mere location. They describe position, orientation, and time, among other fundamentals. They are sigils in essence, but far more potent and difficult. Similar circles to this exist in multiple locations, scattered across the area that is my domain. I am the key that unlocks them, and physically links them to here, or directly to Daramon. Several great mages were tricked by Nedurt into this dull servitude, and I was one of them. It was supposed to be a pact of defense. Heroes, great warriors, and mages from across the Empire would be passing through at any time they were needed. We were to be masters of a vast network that could use these great circles to move a small army, or teams of elites, to any location in Maedra at a moment's notice. This would allow the Empire to quash the greatest of threats, and protect its most isolated interests."
"That sounds like it should be—"
"Exactly right," Vemigold cut her off. "It should have been magnificent." His voice boomed, and his face was stricken by wistful regret. "But the reality is disappointingly dull. In almost 30 years of servitude, since the initial tests were completed, I've only opened the portals a handful of times, and one of those events was a trivial, political matter." His voice was filled with anguish, and Nepeta was moved by the obvious turmoil in his heart. "There lies no excitement in constantly waiting for a call to action that never comes," he continued bitterly. "I used to be someone of importance. I had a life in Daramon, a life that I gave up for Nedurt's worthless ambition. I occasionally hear news of the network being used elsewhere, and all the praise goes to that conceited prince of mages. Those of us who took the time to master the magics, and dedicated our lives to it, we are nothing but his tools."
"Then why do you continue to serve? Why don't you quit? Surely you're not loyal to this charlatan."
Nepeta felt her own anger rising in response to her teacher's distress. "I am loyal to the Empire. I am loyal to my people. Not to mention, I would be made the laughingstock of Daramon, should I abandon my duties," Vemigold growled, his eyes burning with a rage that matched her own. Suddenly, she understood. Vemigold was trapped, just as she was. Only for her, it was due to her illness, her weakness. Unsure how to express this, or if she even should, she decided to do nothing, and the pair smouldered together in silence. Vemigold appeared to be lost in thought for a time, as she was, but he finally seemed to become aware of the present once more, and glanced at her side-on, looking askant embarrassed. "So," he began awkwardly, "now that we have put that to rest, let us proceed with aligning your mind and body to the staff that you were so very kindly given." Nepeta nodded, then looked at Vemigold quizzically. He had just made a joke, she realized, and chuckled, though more at the strangeness of the situation. Her laughter seemed to set him at ease, and he smiled. "Shall we continue, my young apprentice?"
"Yes, Vemigold. Let's," she responded, feeling genuinely at ease for the first time since they had met, and she realized that she was grateful that she had happened upon this place, rather than continuing her journey towards Daramon. As the weeks went by, Nepeta improved in both her skill with magic and her understanding of Imperial script. The language had gradually become less arduous to read, and she was finding that there were very few words she needed to scour the dictionary for, in order to understand what she was reading. Vemigold had even agreed to teach her to speak the tongue, as it would enable her to better grasp the concepts in the books, and prepare her for the future, when she might come into contact with other mages. In her free time, she would sometimes continue her study of magic, but more often, she was too drained and preferred to rest and relax. On one such occasion, she found herself reading about the history of the Northern Plains, and how the Dromean Empire had come to control it. Although the details were somewhat vague, and written from the dwarven perspective, it gave her some insight into the animosity shown by the townsfolk of Perinch. Even her father's loathing of the dwarves could be attributed to what she was able to glean from between the lines in the book. There was mention of an uneasy peace treaty that had lasted for several human generations. When it was broken, the Dromeans were left with no choice but to invade the Northern Plains. Being so close to Daramon and the Dromean mountains, Perinch had been one of the most contested sites. Apparently there were numerous righteous executions and battles fought here, though the humans were no match for dwarven steel and magic. 5 years before she was born, by the year 556, the most recent conflicts had come to an end, and the dwarves began to return to Daramon, leaving behind their dormant portals dotted across the land. The portals remained a symbol of power, and an ever-present threat that the Dromean military could return at any time should the people attempt to resist. Nepeta had difficulty seeing Vermigold as a warrior, but apparently he had fought during these times, among the other mages, though most notably Nedert the Wise. Her teacher's distaste for Nedert had left her skeptical of his greatness, and as she read, she found herself looking into ways to pick apart his character. In the end, she stopped reading the tome, as it was making her too angry, and she needed to rest before the following day's lesson. Vermigold's style of teaching was very different to that of her first teacher, Garina. With the Archprotector, the lessons were rigidly structured, and she had to complete his tasks to the letter before he would allow her to move on, whereas Garina had simply passed her a bottle of ink, some parchment, and a set of written instructions to follow. If she became lost or confused, Garina would show her an example of what must be done, but she never offered insights, nor assistance with individual problems. Nepeta had thought that the solitary deciphering of signs was part of how magic was learned, but Vermigold was very interested in ensuring that she learn in a specific manner. Now that she had experienced both teaching styles, she was unsure which was preferable. Vermigold being particular to the point where it was irritating and controlling, or Garina's somewhat distant approach, and her tendency to simply encourage her to try again, little one. It wasn't like she had a choice, she thought, as she cleared her mind, and begrudgingly allowed Vermigold to pinch her jaw and guide her to stand upright.
"Don't slouch so much," he muttered. "You need to maintain good posture in order to channel efficiently. Yes, I know you don't like standing up straight. You've told me many times."
She tossed her hair out of her face with a jerk of her head and glowered at him, but did not argue. 10 weeks had passed since her lessons with Vermigold had become a daily affair. Winter had given way to spring, and over this time she had grown to be a tiny bit more patient when faced with Vermigold's fixation on proper form.
"Good," he said. "Now try it again."
Dorthu hertet orl. Nepeta spoke the words clearly, a little louder than she would have by her own choice, as per the dwarf's insistence, and felt the icy cold of Kraff's breath course through her veins. Her teeth clenched, and her posture fell apart as she curled inwards, but a moment later, warmth returned to her. "Did it work?" she asked, a little out of breath, as she examined her lavender dress that she had just attempted to enchant. It felt no different as it hung from her shoulders, and the fabric was still soft and loose against her skin.
"Shall we test it?"
Vermigold asked, raising his eyebrows, goading her. "I suppose so," she replied uncertainly, as she stood upright and winced in expectation. Hefting the now almost unrecognizable tome of Nedert's Arcana, Vermigold raised it above his head and tossed it, right at her face. She instinctively leaned back, closing her eyes, but the book never struck her. A moment later, she heard a dull thud, and opened her eyes to see that it had fallen harmlessly to the floor. "It worked?" she asked excitedly, grinning as she looked to Vermigold for affirmation.
"It did," he responded. "Well done. You have successfully cast your first protection spell. As you have seen, it will stop weak attacks against you, but it will also slow a mighty blow, giving you more time to evade, or lessen the impact, should you be unable to. I'd expect that you could now be a formidable foe in a brawl, among common folk, at least."
I'll keep that in mind for the next time I'm in a tavern,
Nepeta replied coldly, as she recalled her brother's untimely end, and her mood was spoiled for the rest of the lesson.